Grace and peace, friends. I'm Austin Suter, joined today by Dr. James Eglinton. Dr. Eglinton is senior lecturer at the School of Theology at the University of Edinburgh and the author of several books and leading expert on all things Bavinck. He's recently published a translation of this one, Personality and Worldview by J.H. Bavinck. Dr. Eglinton, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, Austin. It's great to be here.
Now, I was in seminary before I ever heard the name Bavinck, and maybe I'm just, living under a rock. But I think he's someone who this church has sort of rediscovered in recent years. But when most people think of Bavinck, who are they thinking of?
If they're thinking of him, they're probably thinking of Herman Bavinck.
Okay.
That is J.H. Bavinck's uncle. He was a Dutch theologian and neo-Calvinist. He was born in 1854 and died in 1921. He was fairly obscure for a lot of the 20th century, but he wrote this big 4-volume theological work called Reformed Dogmatics, and that came out in English between 2003 and 2008. And for a big, heavy work of theology, it has really been wildly successful. Beyond anyone's expectations, I think, for how well it would do. It sold a lot of copies, and it's just this standard, resource that pastors and seminarians, theology students very often have on their shelves now, and not just in English either. It's available in Korean, in Chinese, and Portuguese.
Oh, wow.
It's coming out in lots of different languages, in Bahasa, Indonesian. So he's really well known. So I saw someone ask on Twitter not too long ago why he'd never heard of Bavinck until he joined Twitter. And then on Twitter, he's absolutely everywhere. And I was wondering, is this person... what's the motivation here? Is it a kind of complaint that Bavinck can't really matter that much because he'd never heard of this guy until he joined Twitter? But the guy left a comment that I was really touched by, which was that he said he's now blissfully Bavinck aware from being on Twitter. So I like that a lot. I'm going to have that put on some T-shirts maybe.
Absolutely.
Give them away for free with the book, Blissfully Bavinck Aware. So Herman Bavinck, great theologian, and really pretty well known. He was a household name in the Netherlands in his own lifetime, and internationally quite significant in his own lifetime as well. He's the kind of theologian who was received at the White House as a guest when he came to the United States in 1908 by Theodore Roosevelt, as the Dutch would say. So J.H. Bavinck is his nephew. So he's well known in a different kind of context. So if you talk to missionaries or missiologists, J.H. Bavinck will be a much better known name. So he was born in 1895 and he died in 1964. So he's a different generation, and he was Herman's nephew. He spent a couple of significant periods of his life living in Indonesia as a missionary, and he spent a lot of his life teaching missiology at a couple of different schools in the Netherlands. But he doesn't have the same kind of international name recognition yet anyway as his uncle. And I think a large part is that it takes time for works to get translated, and
sure,
not that many people who aren't actually Dutch read Dutch in the world. There aren't too many of us who are reading his works for that reason. So it's taken some time for his works to get picked up on and translated and released in English. For the most part, but that's starting to happen now, and he's a really fantastic writer, a really enriching Christian thinker to engage with on all manner of topics. So I'm really hopeful that actually the Bavinck renaissance will just continue, but with more than one Bavinck now. So not just Herman, but also Johann Herman, or J.H. Bavinck as we call him.
Well, thank you for all of your efforts to make that happen. I was really appreciative of this book. Thank you for. What made you want to translate this one? Presumably, you're reading a lot of his works. What made you pick this?
Yeah. So I first came across one of his works back in the day. I think probably in 2005 or 2006 when I was at seminary here in Edinburgh. And I picked up this big, thick book called An Introduction to the Science of Missions by J.H. Bavinck. And so I read that at seminary, and that was that's probably his best known work in English for decades. So he wrote that quite a long time ago. And that's the kind of textbook that a lot of people have read at some point if they've gone through a seminary degree and they've done missiology. On my radar, I guess, from then on. And I thought of him in the way that most people do at that point, which is, this is the missiology guy. And he's really helpful in thinking through what is mission, how do you relate mission to all the different things that you would learn when you're doing systematic theology. So if you have a biblical anthropology, you're trying to understand what a human being is through the lens of scripture. What is the gospel? How do you relate this to creation, to eschatology? How does missiology take shape in line with all of those things? So I thought of him really as a missiologist. But I didn't go in and read a lot more J.H. Bavinck for quite a long time after that, because I then got on to reading his uncle.
Right.
And, did that for quite a long time, and I'm still doing that very happily. But 2010, at that point I was living in the Netherlands. I'd been working there for 3 years, and I was just about to move back to Scotland because I'd been hired at the university, and I was trying to find copies of books by Herman Bavinck to work with when I came back to Scotland, because in the Netherlands, you've got libraries that have lots of obscure things, and if you're doing research on that kind of stuff, it's a bit of a dream. When out of the blue, an email came in from the librarian at the university where I worked in Kampen, and the librarian had been contacted by a man called Wim Bavinck, who's a member of the Bavinck family, and he had some Bavinck books and wanted to pass them on to the library. But the library already had copies of all of them. So the library knew that I was just about to leave the country.
Oh, wow.
Was looking for all these books. So the librarian emailed to say, here's the address, you can go and meet him, and which was just a fantastic experience. It was so interesting to talk to some members of the Bavinck family about the family history. So I left their house with a few boxes of books, which were mostly by Herman Bavinck, but there was also a stack of J.H. Bavinck books that are, again, untranslated, that I hadn't read before. But I had so many books by Herman to work through that I did that for quite a few years, for about a decade actually, without really making a dent in the J.H. Bavinck books. But in the COVID pandemic, the way that all things work together for good, our building here at the university was shut down, the library was shut down, and this coincided with a sabbatical that I had. And I had plans to work on lots of other things, but because I couldn't get to a library, I had to work with the books that I had. And I'd worked through a lot of the Herman Bavinck books and thought, I haven't really made many inroads into the J.H. Bavinck stuff. So maybe this would be an unplanned but useful way to spend my sabbatical. So I did a 6-month deep dive through the works of J.H. Bavinck and was really blown away by what I found there, because although his missiology is really significant work and it's quite brilliant, he was really a bit of a polymath at heart, a bit of a Renaissance man. So he wrote, for example, a complete commentary on the New Testament.
Oh, wow.
It's really, it's a great piece of work, and it's informed by his experience outside the Western world as well. He wrote a lot on psychology, quite a few books that are really helpful thinking in a Christian way about psychology in the context of psychoanalysis and Jung and Freud and all those major figures who still shape the world, the Western world anyway, that if we live in that today. He wrote a lot of stuff on cultural analysis, cultural critique. He had so many diverse interests that he held together. And I was really surprised by just how broad his interests were. Okay, if I want to try and show people, gives people some kind of an on-ramp that could lead them into lots of different areas of J.H. Bavinck's thought, which would be the most helpful book to do all of this? So there are a couple of different phases in his life that are quite different. So particularly the 2 periods that he spent as a missionary in Indonesia. So the first time that he was there, he was very much a pastor to expats, because it's the Dutch East Indies at that point, and he's still engaging with people who are either Westerners or quite Westernized. But then when he went back for the second period as a missionary, he was like a Hudson Taylor kind of figure. So he really went native as much as he could. He took on a local name, worked in a local language, and really pursued quite a deep way to embed himself in local culture and look at what happens when you plant the gospel in that culture. So also was looking for a book that was written somewhere between those periods that would also show what he's thinking through that makes him face that so differently theologically. So this book is the one that I identified that I think is it's an on-ramp to a lot of different things in J.H. Bavinck. It was written in between his 2 periods in Indonesia. It's on what's called personality and worldview, so it connects what he's thinking about biblical exegesis, the importance of Augustine in his thinking, Big questions about cultural analysis. How do you make sense of Western culture, but also non-Western culture? The psychology work that he was doing is a big part of this book as well, in understanding the human psyche, the inner faculties of the human soul. So this one book it's quite a short book. I think it's fairly accessible. If you like to read books that will stretch you a bit, it's not like reading Charles Taylor's A Secular Age or something like that will take you the next 3 years of your life.
Right.
So it's not a light read in that sense, but it's what I loved about this book when I discovered it first was that it actually began as a series of lectures to engineering students. So it's not written for theologians, and in that regard, it's popular in the first place with the kind of aspiration he has as a communicator. So he was invited to give lectures to a Christian engineering student society at a university in the Netherlands, and these are the lectures that he gave. So he's assuming that his audience, has had some kind of education in philosophy, that they're biblically literate, they are theologically interested. And he's a really skilled communicator and can pull off this kind of
Definitely.
thing. So I think for all of those different reasons, with trying to think, okay, in a longer term sense, I'd like to open up his works for other people. So which book would be the most helpful stepping stone for what other things that might appear? And I think this is the one.
Well, I'm really glad you picked this one. Obviously, I haven't read the rest of them, but I found this one just to be a really helpful word correction into sort of how Western Christians think about worldview. We'll get into some of that context later, but at its most basic level, I mean, this is a book about how we understand the world, ourselves, how we relate to God, how we relate to others, and sort of the relationship between all of those things. I was wondering if you could define or explain a few of these concepts that feature heavily in the book. First one just being personality.
Yeah, sure. So personality is a really big buzzword in the 1920s in Western European culture and Dutch culture. You could think of it as what we might talk about more as individuality nowadays. Personality in an English-speaking context 100 years on, quite often it's a bit of a shallow term. It's either a shallow term in terms of, if you have a lot of personality, it just means that you like to have fun. And it's possible to be someone who has no personality at all if you're just really dull. Or we think of it in terms of, personality tests, Enneagram, Myers-Briggs, all that kind of stuff. But in his 1920s context, it's really, how do you explain your individuality? What makes you you and not someone else? So he's trying to give a really richly Christian account of that, of individuality or personality. So the way that he's thinking about this is the human psyche, the human soul, the human inner life has some basic faculties, and humans have these in general. So your inner life is receptive in the first place. There's a world that exists beyond you, and you're receptive to what's not yourself, what's out there. So you're always receiving impressions of things. So your soul exists in relation to the world beyond itself, or your inner life exists in relation to an outer world. Your soul also, or your inner life, conserves some of those impressions. So, there's a million and one different things that are, that you could be aware of in any environment that you're in, and you don't remember every single one of them, or at least most of us don't. Maybe, if you think of savants who can fly over New York City and then spend the next 10 years drawing a picture that has every single detail of what they could see from the helicopter window. Most of us don't conserve things to that degree, and we filter out a lot. So that's a faculty that you have, not to remember or be burdened by remembering every single thing that you're receptive to. So you conserve some things, and your inner life also appreciates things. And so it finds more joy or more beauty or more value in some things over others. So you look out into the world in a way that makes those judgments and that is capable of appreciation. And that's some of the basis for why you conserve some things rather than others. But the last faculty that's common to the human inner life is longing. So the soul longs it longs for things beyond itself. It longs to make the world into a particular kind of place according to your desires and longings. Ultimately, you're driven by longing for God, J.H. Bavinck will say. So everyone has those common faculties, but those faculties aren't all balanced out in the same way for every single person. So instead, a personality is actually something that you become for J.H. Bavinck as you try and work out how do all of these things relate? A personality is an attempt to synthesize or to reach some kind of workable balance for all of these different faculties. So JH will say that some people have more passive personalities because the faculty of being receptive to things outside you is maybe a bit overgrown, and then conserving, appreciating, longing are a bit underdeveloped. Some people can be, real control freaks because the capacity for longing, appreciation, those faculties really are overgrown and imbalanced against being receptive and remembering that other people also want to long and make the world into things as well. So we're all some kind of distinct configuration of the same set of faculties. And the balance or the synthesis, usually the imbalance actually, for all of us apart from Jesus, J.H. Bavinck will say, and I agree with him on that, like the end result of how you're trying to hold these different things together is the thing that speaks as an I. That's you being aware of yourself, and you speak out into the world and give voice to that as I, and you're aware that you are you and not someone else. So that's the basic idea of personality in the book. Alongside that, the two other key terms that you mentioned are worldview and world vision.
Yes.
And this is the first thing that got me really excited about this book when I read it, because it's quite a creative thing that he comes up with here. So worldview in his thinking means something quite different to particularly what American evangelicals mean by the term. And I try and set this out in the introduction to the book as well. So worldview isn't really a big thing in British Christianity or British culture, but it's much more influential in American culture. And in American culture, worldview is, it's quite an abstract intellectual set of propositions. There are these 5 points that I can write down. And if you say you agree with these 5 points, then you have a Christian worldview. And you can acquire it really quickly as long as you agree with it. But what J.H. Bavinck means by worldview is something very different. So in the truest sense of the word, for J.H. Bavinck, only God actually has a proper view of the entire world and life within it that is exhaustive. Only an infinite God can have a full view of a finite but massive universe and the complexity of everything that happens within it. And only God can have that with perfect wisdom as well. So only God truly has a worldview. But worldview is something that humans are meant to move towards, actually in being made for our Creator. So because God is the truth and has exhaustive truth and truth and wisdom and grace and love, we are made to move towards Him and to seek Him, to desire Him, to want to be like Him. So worldview is something that you should spend your whole life moving towards as you move towards God and looking to grow in wisdom in how you will understand the world and live within it and live well within it before the face of God. But one of the surprising things about this book is for a lot of people who are used to talking about worldview and who assume that everybody has a worldview of one kind or another, J.H. Bavinck argues that although worldview is so extremely important, almost no individual person actually has a worldview. So instead, he gives us a different idea, different concept to describe what we have, or the starting point that we have, which is the idea of world vision. So I think the clearest illustration that I've tried to come up with to explain maybe the difference between these two is if you imagine, let's stick with New York City, you walk through the streets of New York City and you spend your whole life doing this, only ever with your immediate first-person perspective, with what you can see with your own eyes as you look out. So you've seen street after street after street. But imagine if you've never, climbed to the top of a skyscraper, or you've never been in a helicopter or flown a drone or something like that up above New York to give you a view of the whole thing. So you might have vision as you go through it, from street to street, but vision is not the same as a view, a vista that takes in the whole thing. So world vision is like a lens that you look through, like a first-person perspective that you are given by the particular community and the culture that you're born into. But that's not the same as a worldview. So world vision is different. And actually, so another illustration that I use in the introduction is to say that a world vision is like an autopilot setting that comes pre-programmed. You get that by being born into a particular culture. It teaches you to intuit how to live within the world. in a way that's kind of livable and workable, even if you never put it to the test. It'll get you from street to street or from day to day, but it might not actually be the truth about the world. I think J.H. Bavinck's own way of illustrating the difference between the two is that a worldview is really like a map. It can tell you what it's like where you're standing in the coordinates, but also it can tell you what things are like 1,000 miles away, in another direction, even if you can't see that place from where you are. But you know that you could use the map to get from one place to another. Whereas a world vision it's a tool of navigation, but it's not like a map. It's much more like a compass.
Right.
So it can tell you, like, okay, if I step, it can only ever tell you what's one step away, and it'll orient you in the world in terms of basic directions, but it can't do what a map does, which is to tell you what is, how to navigate the whole place. And the thing with worldview building for J.H. Bavinck is, rather than, that you watch like a 5-minute YouTube video that promises that you will have a Christian worldview by the end of it.
Right.
You have to build the map yourself, and it's going to take your whole life. It's going to, you keep on expanding the map for the rest of your life if you're pursuing the truth about God and the world. So it's a really interesting set of ideas. I got very excited about them when I discovered the book. And I think that the world vision distinction it's really amazingly useful and important. It's very hard to unsee, actually, in how you make sense of yourself, and then how you pursue knowledge of yourself, but also then the way that you move from world view to world vision in this book is actually through the gospel itself. The gospel is the thing that puts your world vision to the test. So actually, the book is almost a book about sanctification.
Yeah, it is.
It's how do you take the person that you are, formed in the cultural soil that you were first planted in, and all the ways that all the assumptions that gives you about the world and yourself and God. Okay, if that's where you are, nobody comes from nowhere. We're all from somewhere. How do you go from that? Or what's the standard that you use to put that to the test and work out, do I actually live by lies or live according to the truth? And then how do I move from this starting point, which is, very subjective, and, which is very untested. It asks me to trust in it, and just live like my culture says I should live. How do I put that to the test and then pursue truth? So how do I actually pursue worldview or pursue my creator, actually? And in this book, he argues that the gospel is itself that standard, and the gospel is the thing that will look into and examine all of the ways that your culture tells you to live within the world. And that means that some of those things will need to change, because the gospel will always sanctify whichever person it finds, whichever cultural norms it finds. And then the beauty of this book is that then it explains how your personality actually changes. So your personality is not fixed in the way that a lot of millennials think it is today. It'll reshape you. And it might sound very Joel Osteen, but it will make you the best version of yourself in a really meaningful theological way. And I think that's such a beautiful argument to come across. So I was really just captivated and compelled by the book. So so that's why I really wanted to translate it as well.
Yeah. Well, thank you again for doing that. I'm grateful for people like you who are able to do this work. So Tim Keller wrote in his foreword that a Christian in one country won't develop the same worldview as a Christian in another. That seems counterintuitive, I think, to a lot of evangelicals. We assume, okay, all truth is God's truth. It should be the same for everyone everywhere. Why is that not the case?
It's not the case because in God's providence, we are finite creatures, and we're born into a creation that is made for cultural diversity. It's not made for cultural uniformity. So in J.H. Bavinck's way of thinking, and you can trace this a little bit further back to Herman Bavinck, you'll find the same set of ideas, and Abraham Kuyper before that, they see uniformity in a global cultural sense as actually a form of resistance against the providence and purposes of God in the world. So if you trace this all the way back to the doctrine of creation for them, when God commands Adam and Eve to be fruitful and multiply and to spread out across the world, that was not a command to be rigidly uniform in their culture as they spread across the world. And in fact, that's just not a reflection of what human life is like. Human life is not static in a cultural sense. So they would see, for example, in how they read the Tower of Babel, in Genesis 11, part of the sin of the Babelites was that they wanted a static, uniform culture, and they wanted their culture to be the same that everyone else looks up to, and they want to be famous, and it's a kind of mini world empire, and those are the kind of like totalizing empires that guys like the Bavincks and Kuiper would say, you see this in the Babylonians, and you see it in the Romans, and much closer to home for them in the Netherlands, they would say you saw it in Napoleon and the French Revolution, the desire to impose one culture on everyone everywhere. But they would say that actually the way that that God has made us to inhabit the world and to spread out across it means that we'll live in very different, diverse environments, and culturally we will be different. So we're not all going to be exactly the same. For which reason, people will have different questions also across different historical periods, as well as different parts of the world in the same period. And the kinds of questions that they will ask will be different. They would see, or they did see history also as a kind of progress as well. So we're connected to the people of all ages. History is made to move. Again, history isn't static. So with all of that, you're always born somewhere, and it might sound weird to say grammatically, but you're born somewhen as well.
Yeah.
Okay, you're born at a particular period in a particular place. That's just part of being finite, that you're limited to a set of home coordinates in time and space. And they would say that that's actually a gift of God's common grace to you, that you don't come from nowhere, that God actually gives you that set of home coordinates. But those home coordinates will just be really different. If you're a 16th century French peasant, if you live in Los Angeles, if you're born there in 2023, if you're born in South Korea, if you're born in Botswana 100 years ago, those home coordinates are all really different. But the ubiquity of the gospel, the gospel's ability to address people everywhere, is actually something. So J.H. Bavinck has a great little book on this, not translated yet, but hopefully one day. It's called The Word for the World. And his argument in that book is, what he's trying to ask is, why is it that the Bible historically is so successful at reaching people and so effective at reaching people who come from so many different backgrounds? So you can translate the Bible into any language, and that doesn't come without challenges. If you read Lamsana's book on this, there's some really hilarious things there. Difficulties in translation. How do you translate texts written about being in the desert to Inuits who've never seen sand, right, or something like that, right? So, those things are really difficult. But at the same time, the Bible is translatable to people from such vastly different cultural starting points, and it's strangely, amazingly effective at reaching them. And the thing that J.H. Bavinck points out in that book is that we quite often read the Bible and assume that from Genesis to Revelation, every human being, every human actor in those texts is from the same cultural environment. And we'll talk about the world of the Bible. But actually, if you are, Lydia, the seller of purple cloth, an international businesswoman in the book of Acts, you come from a very different world to the world of Abraham and Sarah. Right. And actually, the Bible addresses people from so many different cultures within the Bible itself. So his argument is that it shouldn't be any surprise that this one book is so, transculturally effective and applicable, in that the book itself addresses people from so many different cultures. So his argument there, which ties in really well with personality and worldview, is that the gospel is always, it's God pursuing and encountering finite human beings who, because we're finite, we live in these, our home coordinates will all be different. And yet the gospel confronts each of us where we are. And all these finite individuals are being drawn towards the same creator and redeemer. So you could think of it almost like, if you imagine like the image of a circle where, we all have different points on the edge of the circle, but the gospel points us all in towards the same center, which is the Trinity. And that means that the gospel is the same gospel that is refining us and changing us. But with something like trying to build a Christian worldview, the point that Tim Keller made in the introduction was, and I guess he was pointing to, like Grace Utanto, who I work a lot with, not on this book, but on other books. One of my former PhD students, he teaches at RTS in Washington, DC. He's Indonesian. I'm Scottish. For us to build, or to try and build a Christian worldview in Jakarta and in Edinburgh means that, Gray has to ask all kinds of questions there that I don't in Scotland, because I don't live in a Muslim majority country. We both, he lives in the US now, but when he was living in Indonesia, the kind of questions we ask about what it means to be a Christian in democracy, those are also subtly quite different questions, because Indonesian democracy is not the same as Scottish democracy. So the kind of questions that we ask will be different. And then the kind of questions that the Christians in the US and Scotland ask will be different as well. So if the idea is that a Christian worldview has to be completely uniform for all of us in all of these settings, it starts to look kind of like, rather than the Christian worldview being something that's really expansive and huge, it makes it look very parochial and particular and local.
Yeah.
And I don't think that's a good thing. Like, I don't think that makes the glory of God shine all the more. I think that J.H. Bavinck's argument is that you see the glory of God, you see the beauty actually of monotheism, of having a creator distinction, if it's possible to move towards a Christian worldview from every conceivable cultural starting point. I think that's awesome. That's a much better thing than the idea that there's just this one rigid Christian worldview, because usually what that means in reality is that you have people from very dominant, powerful cultures who expect that every Christian in a less geopolitically powerful country has to have an opinion on the same opinion on what this looks like in the United States, for example. That's just not how it should work in the world, I think. And this book is a really good argument against that.
Well, I agree, and that's why it was so refreshing for me, because you've mentioned Christians in different countries having different perspectives. In a country like the United States, which has such varied experiences and often according to ethnicity, it would make sense that Christians in the same time and place can have vastly different perspectives, and those perspectives both be valid. But that's not often how we operate in the church. Sadly, I think we can do exactly what you're saying not to do, which is to assume that every Christian should have the same concern about the same things that I do and try and impose that on others. And when it happens across ethnic lines, that's particularly discouraging. But since we brought up ethnicity, the Bavinck family was kind of unique for how they perceived race and racism even in their time. Is there any way you could speak to about that in the few minutes we have left?
Yeah, sure. Herman is really interesting in this regard, and I tried to cover this in the biography that I wrote of him that came out in 2020. And this was probably the first attempt to read all of these manuscripts that he left behind from his time in North America, particularly his journey there in 1908. So he went there to Princeton Seminary to give the Stone Lectures, which were prestigious guest lectures. And he'd been in the United States before, in 1892, and he was quite young then, and he had a very particular, travel philosophy that was the kind of thing that, elite Europeans had. There's this art of travel, and you go there never to criticize things that are foreign. You just try and appreciate what's different. And so he really held his tongue with whatever his thoughts were on American culture, much more so when he was young. But I think when he came back in 1908, he was older, and he seems to have given up on that philosophy, and we really find out what he thought. So he read a lot of particularly African-American authors. He was reading Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois, and he left behind quite detailed notes where he's trying to understand the place of African-Americans in American culture and changing demographics. So there are a lot of different things that are happening in his life in that period, where he's thinking a lot as well about race in Europe, particularly the experience of Jewishness as an ethnic experience, and trying to understand the experience of being Jewish as very different from the experience of being Christian, in that Christianity is a religious identity that's not tied to one's ethnicity, and how Bavinck thought of it, whereas Jewish religious identity was tied to ethnicity, and you can renounce Christianity as an identity in a way that ethnically you can't renounce being Jewish. And he's thinking about all of this in the context of Europe approaching World War I, and the very hard experiences of Jews across the border in Germany. So I have a chapter in a book that's coming out this summer that tries to get into some of that. And actually the impetus for that at the beginning was a blog post I wrote for you guys that you invited me to think about. So I've been writing about him so in that regard, which is really interesting because he's an Orthodox Reformed Christian theologian who thinks that it's really important for people within his camp to take those issues really seriously and to think about theology as it relates to social experience and not to think theologically in really abstract, like docetic terms, as though people just seem to be human, but they're not really, and their flesh and blood experiences don't matter. So for Bavinck, and so what I've tried to do in this book chapter that I mentioned is chart out the development of how he thinks about of race as embodied experience, and how you see this particularly in things that he writes about Jewishness over his lifetime. So if you look at his writings quite early on when he's young, Jewish is just an abstract religious shadowboxing category, or it's an ancient identity from the New Testament. But then as he goes on, you can chart this over a few decades, he really starts to think much more about what it's like to experience racism actually as a Jew in Europe. And I think you can see this as a kind of parallel to what he's thinking about the African-American experience. I think J.H. Bavinck is also a really interesting and neglected figure in this regard, because in his own lifetime, he was a prominent anti-apartheid voice in the Netherlands. And he wrote a book that came out in 1957, had Rassenvraagstuk, so the question of races. And so he spent 8 months in South Africa as a visiting professor. His opinion on apartheid really changed so in those years. And so the view that he'd been presented with before he went there, and this is before instant mass media and
sure.
In this period, you're kind of reliant on what people have told you until you go and see things for yourself. So what he'd been told before he went to South Africa about apartheid was, well, this is a way of making sure that people aren't forced to homogenize and people are culturally diverse, and apartheid is a system that means that the integrity of that is protected and they're not forced to all step into some kind of melting pot. And with the kind of bare details that he'd been presented with, it was very different to the apartheid that he actually saw when he spent 8 months in South Africa. So he came back and then wrote a book about it and became a very prominent critique of the apartheid regime. But I think what I found really useful about J.H. Bavinck in that book is that, and it actually ties in with some of the things we've already discussed about how human culture is non-uniform. And that's also the case in terms of the outworking of sin in the world and in the fallenness of the world, that different cultures are differently fallen and corrupted and twisted. So the book is a really interesting argument about how we have to have a globally diverse a set of ways of thinking about racism, that racism actually works itself out differently in different cultures. And therefore, the way that you have to deal with it in a particular culture has to be, tailor-made for that culture. And solving racism in one culture doesn't mean that therefore you've got the solution for every other culture.
Yeah.
So he became very attuned to how racism in South Africa is different to racism in North America, and it's different to racism in Europe. And he'd seen a lot of racism in Indonesia and how racism is different in India. I think that he really perceives the scale of the problem and as a global issue and just how hard it is to overcome it. So I think what I really appreciate about his work on this is that it's like there's a realism there from believing that the fall truly happened and that humanity is really not in good shape. And the complexity of what that looks like across the world is a startling thing to behold. So there's not a kind of simplistic, high-handed, hey, here's racism and we're going to solve the problem in 1, 2, 3. But at the same time, he's not passive about it. The gospel brings hope, and the gospel changes things in the world. So I found him really, really helpfully realistic on both sin and grace, but applied with a lot of nuance to the issue of race. So maybe that's another book that needs to go on the long list of J.H. Bavinck works for translation. Because I think that he really takes the conversation forward a lot more than Herman. What Herman has to say in the United States is very powerful and convicting. And I think for Reformed people who have a lot of time for him and respect for him, he is a distinct kind of voice.
He is.
Because this is a very conservative Orthodox Christian who's not afraid to call things out. But at the same time, Herman died in 1921. He's very much a Western European, quite colonial era thinker, and he just hadn't seen the things that his nephew saw. And you need someone to come along and develop the instincts that Herman had with a lot more focus and specificity. But that's what J.H. did as his nephew on a bunch of issues. So Personality and Worldview is like the follow-up to Herman's book on Christian worldview. I think his book on the issue of race is like a follow-up to some of what his uncle had to say about race as well. So as a family, they're really fascinating on that issue. Well worth careful exploration.
Yeah, I agree. Excuse me, I wish they weren't so unique in that regard. But I'm very grateful for them and for their contribution. And thank you for bringing them and making them more accessible to people like me. So thank you again for this work. I've been really blessed by it.
Thanks, Austin.
In our remaining time, I'd love to close with prayer just for all of us to be more thoughtful, more consistent, more like J.H. in that regard. Does that sound good?
Yep.
Father, thank you for minds like J.H. Bavinck. Thank you for the perspective you were able to give him to see things outside of his own experience. Thank you for giving him so many different experiences that are able to form a more broad perspective. Lord, we just pray for each of us that we wouldn't use our own experience as a tool against others, that you would make us humble, that you would make us thoughtful, and that we would do what he did in seeking to apply the gospel to all of these areas and be more conformed to the image of Christ. Pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Well, thank you for your time, Dr. Eglinton. I almost called you Dr. Bavinck there. That's how conflated we are. But really appreciate
it. I told a lot that I look like Herman, so yeah.
Yeah, I saw that on Twitter. You were comparing old photos. So that's not intentional. That's just a thing that happens.
It's when people look like their pets. Yeah, thanks for having me on your podcast. I enjoyed it.
Yes, thank you for all your work, and we will link to this book. We will link to your article in the show notes. Thank you again for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.